The morning fog hadn't lifted yet over Naval Air Station Coronado when Commander Elena Vasquez stepped out of her car and buttoned the top of her service coat against the October chill. She stood for a moment in the parking lot, letting the cool salt air settle into her lungs the way she always did before a hard day. It was a habit she had carried since her very first deployment, back when she was a 23-year-old lieutenant who didn't know anything about the world except that she wanted to serve it. She was 41 now. She had learned a great deal since then. The base was already alive with movement at 6:30. Sailors crossed the concrete walkways in pairs and small groups, most of them looking down at phones or talking in the half-awake way that men and women do when the coffee hasn't quite taken hold. A few nodded in her direction. Most did not. She had been stationed here for 7 weeks, and in that time she had learned that Coronado had its own rhythm, its own culture, its own invisible walls. And she, coming from a career that had nothing to do with the SEAL teams and everything to do with naval intelligence, was on the outside of all of it. That was fine. Elena Vasquez had spent her entire career on the outside of something. She was born in Laredo, Texas, a border town that smelled like diesel and mesquite smoke and the particular kind of tired that working people carry in their shoulders. Her father, Hector, had driven a delivery truck for 31 years. Her mother, Rosa, cleaned hotel rooms at the Courtyard by Marriott off the interstate until her knees gave out. They were not wealthy people. They were not connected people. What they had was a small house with a leaky roof, a vegetable garden in the backyard, and an absolute, unshakable belief that their daughter could become something that neither of them had words for yet. Elena had believed it too. She had applied to the Naval Academy at Annapolis on a dare from her high school history teacher, a retired Marine captain named Mr. Broussard, who saw something in her that she hadn't seen in herself yet. She got in. She graduated in the top 8% of her class. She was commissioned as an ensign in the United States Navy on a warm spring day while her parents stood in the crowd and her mother cried without making a sound. The way Rosa Vasquez always cried, quietly, so as not to take up too much space. 20 years had passed since that day. Elena had served in 3 theaters. She had been cited for valor during an operation in the Gulf that she was not permitted to discuss publicly. She had worked alongside the CIA, the DIA, and twice with a unit so classified that its name appeared in no official documents she had ever seen. She had risen steadily, carefully, on the strength of work and judgment, and the kind of patience that only comes from knowing you have to be twice as good to be considered half as worthy. She was a commander in naval intelligence. She had a record that would make most officers fall quiet if they read it carefully. Most of the people at Coronado had not read it carefully. The briefing room on the 2nd floor of the Joint Operations Building was already half full when she arrived. 8 officers sat around a long table made of pressed wood that was trying very hard to look like something more expensive. The room smelled like burned coffee and dry erase markers. A whiteboard at the front showed a series of satellite images pinned together in a rough grid, and a projector hummed but hadn't been turned on yet. Elena took a seat at the side of the table, not the head, not the foot, but the kind of middle position that said she was present without demanding anything. She set her folder down, uncapped her pen and waited. The other officers around the table were mostly Navy, mostly men, most of them between 10 and 20 years younger than she was in terms of career time in the SEAL community. She recognized a few faces from the base directory she had memorized her first week. Lieutenant Commander Derek Howell sat directly across from her. He was 36, blonde, with the kind of easy confidence that came from being good-looking and right more often than most people. He glanced at her when she sat down, then looked back at his phone without a word. 3 seats to her left was Captain James Rourke, who ran the Operational Planning Division and who had, in their only previous conversation, spent 4 minutes explaining to her how naval intelligence worked in the field, as if she hadn't spent the last 20 years doing exactly that. She had let him explain. It wasn't worth the energy. The door opened at 6:45 sharp and the room stood. Rear Admiral William Thorne walked in the way that men like him always walked, like the room had been waiting for him specifically, and was relieved he had finally arrived. He was 60, broad-shouldered, with silver hair cut so precisely it looked like it had been measured. His uniform was immaculate. He wore his rank like a second skin, and why wouldn't he? He had been a SEAL for over 30 years, had run operations that were legend inside the community, and had the kind of career that got written about in books that sat on the shelves of Pentagon offices. He was also, in Alina's professional assessment, a man who had decided long ago that he already knew everything worth knowing. At ease, he said, and the room settled. He moved to the head of the table and stood looking at the satellite images on the board. He did not sit. Thorne was the kind of man who gave briefings standing up, as if sitting down meant yielding something. "I've reviewed the preliminary intelligence package on the Morales network," he said, referencing a narco-trafficking operation that had begun spilling into military supply routes in 3 different regions. "I want to hear from planning first. Rourke." Captain Rourke began his rundown. Alina listened, took notes, and waited for the moment that she knew was coming. Because the intelligence package that Thorne was referencing, the one that had been compiled and analysed over the previous 3 weeks, was her work. Not entirely her work, but the core of it, the framework that connected 12 seemingly unrelated data points into a coherent picture of the network's command structure, had come from her analysis. She had submitted it on a Friday afternoon, through the proper chain, clearly labelled and sourced. No one had mentioned her name in connection with it yet. That was not unusual. When Rourke finished, Thorne looked around the table. "Questions, pushback, let's hear it." Alina spoke. "Admiral, I'd like to add some context to the supply route analysis. There are 3 nodes in the eastern corridor that the current plan doesn't account for. Based on communication pattern shifts in the last 72 hours, I believe the network has moved its primary staging point. The package I submitted Friday identified the likely new location." Silence settled over the table like a lid dropping onto a pot. Thorne looked at her. It was the kind of look that was not unfriendly, exactly, but it was assessing in the way that a person looks at something they weren't expecting to find on their desk. "And you are," he said. It was not a question that came from forgetting. It was a question that came from making a point. "Commander Vasquez, sir, Naval Intelligence. I was assigned to your staff 7 weeks ago." "Right," he looked back at the board. "The intelligence package was reviewed by my team, Commander. We're satisfied with the analysis as presented." "Respectfully, sir, the communication intercepts from the last 3 days suggest." "Commander," his voice didn't rise, it didn't need to. "This is an operational planning meeting. The intelligence phase has been completed and reviewed. If you have supplemental materials you'd like to submit through the appropriate channels, I'd encourage you to do so." He paused. "Through the appropriate channels." The words landed like a hand pressing down on her shoulder. Through the appropriate channels. As if she were a junior enlisted sailor who had wandered into the wrong room. As if she hadn't submitted her analysis through exactly those channels, and it had been absorbed into a report and presented at this table without a single reference to its origin. She nodded once. "Understood, sir." Thorne moved on. The meeting continued for another 40 minutes. Alina took notes and said nothing else, and no one looked at her again. After the briefing in the corridor outside, Derek Howell fell into step beside her. He was taller than her by about 5 inches, and he had a loose, athletic walk that she supposed came from years of physical training. He wasn't cruel, she had not found him to be cruel, but he was the kind of person who said the thing that was in his head before he'd thought about whether it should stay there. "For what it's worth," he said. Keeping his voice low, "the old man runs a tight ship. He doesn't love outside voices in operational meetings." "I'm not an outside voice," Alina said. "I'm assigned to this staff." "Yeah, but you know what I mean. Intel and Ops have always had a," he made a gesture with his hand that meant something like a complicated relationship. "Culture gap. I've worked with operational units for 20 years, Lieutenant Commander." He held up both hands. "I'm just saying it's not personal." "It never is," she said. She kept walking. That evening, Alina drove 20 minutes off base to a small diner in a town called Elsinore that sat just off Highway 74. It was the kind of place that had been there since the 1970s and intended to keep being there until the building fell down. Red vinyl booths, a laminated menu, coffee that came automatically and without being asked for. She came here most evenings when she could. The owner, a woman named Patty who was somewhere between 65 and eternal, had stopped asking why Alina ate alone after the 2nd week. Some people ate alone because they were lonely. Patty seemed to understand that Alina ate alone because it was the only hour in the day that belonged entirely to her. Alina ordered the pot roast and opened a small notebook she carried everywhere. It was not an official document. It was personal, a habit from her earliest days in intelligence, when her first supervisor, a brilliant and exhausting woman named Captain Arlene Doss, had told her that the act of writing by hand slowed the mind down enough to let the truth catch up. She wrote 3 words at the top of the page: staging point, Eastern Corridor. Then she drew 3 small circles and connected them with lines. The network had moved, she was certain of it. The communication pattern shift wasn't ambiguous. It was the kind of deliberate, coordinated frequency change that an organization made when it believed it had been observed and needed to relocate its center of gravity. She had seen it before twice in different parts of the world with different players. The pattern was the pattern. But she had been told, politely and in front of 8 other officers, to use the appropriate channels. She had used the appropriate channels. Her analysis had been used without credit, and then the door had been closed on anything further she might contribute. She picked up her coffee and looked out the window at the highway, where headlights moved in both directions in the dark. The thing about being dismissed, she had learned over 20 years, was that it was rarely a dramatic event. Nobody called you a name. Nobody threw your work in the trash in front of you. It happened in looks and in tones, and in the particular way a senior officer said your name as if reading it for the first time from a list. It happened in the moment after you spoke, when the room moved on as if you hadn't. That was the machinery of it, small, quiet, relentless. She had 2 choices. She could sit inside that machinery and let it grind, or she could do the thing she had always done. Put her head down, do the work, and trust that truth had a way of arriving whether or not it had been invited. She finished her pot roast and left Patty a 20 for a $12 meal. 3 days later, Elena submitted a formal supplemental intelligence assessment, 12 pages, fully sourced, with annotated communication intercepts and a geospatial analysis of vehicle movement patterns in the Eastern Corridor. She submitted it through Commander Rourke's office, as the established chain required. She received an automated acknowledgement email at 3:47 a.m. the following morning. No follow-up, no response. On the base, she continued to do her job. She attended meetings she was invited to, which were fewer than they should have been for someone of her assignment. She contributed when given the floor, which was less often than the others. She reviewed documents, produced analysis, and kept her office orderly and her notes precise. She also listened. That was the thing that people who underestimated intelligence officers always forgot. Intelligence, at its core, was not about dramatic action. It was about the slow accumulation of information that other people didn't think was being collected. It was about patience. It was about noticing what was happening in the margins while everyone was watching the center. And Elena, over those weeks at Coronado, had been noticing quite a lot. She had noticed, for instance, that 2 of the operational elements tasked to the Morale's network operation were receiving their mission parameters from a planning document that had not been updated to reflect the communication intercepts she had flagged. She had noticed that the timeline Rourke had built assumed the network's staging was still in its original location, which her analysis indicated was almost certainly wrong. She had noticed that Admiral Thorne, for all his certainty, was operating on intelligence that was 3 weeks old in a situation that was moving. She had brought this up twice through internal channels, once by email to Rourke, once in a brief written note that she flagged as requiring acknowledgement, which she walked personally to the administrative officer. Neither had generated a response. On a Thursday morning in mid-October, Lieutenant Commander Howell stopped by her office, a small, unadorned room off the main corridor with a window that looked at a concrete wall. He leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed, looking mildly uncomfortable. "The assessment you submitted," he said. "Yes." Rourke read it. "I'm glad to hear it." Howell glanced behind him into the corridor, then back at her. "He thinks you're overreaching, his word, not mine." Elena looked at him steadily. "Does he think the analysis is wrong?" Howell was quiet for a moment. That was answer enough. "He thinks this isn't your lane," Howell said finally. "I'm a naval intelligence officer assigned to this staff," Elena said. "Providing intelligence analysis is exactly my lane." "I know that," he paused. "Look, Commander Elena, I'm not the enemy here. I'm just trying to give you a realistic picture of the environment you're operating in." "I appreciate that." She meant it. "What do you think the Admiral would say if the operation goes forward on the original plan and the staging point isn't where they think it is?" Howell's expression shifted in a way that was hard to read, something between reluctant acknowledgement and self-protection. That's an operational risk question, he said, above both our pay grades. It's an intelligence question, she said, which is precisely my pay grade. He pushed himself off the doorframe. I tried, he said not unkindly. I know, she said, thank you. He left. Elena turned back to her desk and the yellow legal pad where she had been working through a new set of intercepts that had come in that morning. Outside, through the window, she could hear the distant sound of helicopters on their training runs. She thought about her mother, cleaning hotel rooms on bad knees. About her father, driving the same route in the same truck for 31 years. Neither of them had ever had anyone hand them anything. They had built their lives out of the hours they put in and nothing else, and they had built something real. She picked up her pen and kept working. The truth was coming. She could feel it the way you feel whether before it arrives a change in pressure, a shift in the quality of the air. She was going to be ready when it did. The call came on a Friday evening at 6:22 p.m. Elena was still in her office. She was usually one of the last to leave, when her secure desk phone rang with an internal extension she didn't recognize. She picked it up, Commander Vasquez. A pause, then a voice she had heard before, but not on the phone, careful, precise, with the faint accent of someone who had grown up somewhere flat and Midwestern. Commander, this is Deputy Director Calloway. We need to speak. She sat very still. Deputy Director Alan Calloway was not a name she had expected to hear at 6:22 on a Friday at Coronado. He was the number 2 at the Defense Intelligence Agency. She had met him exactly once 4 years ago during a joint task force review in Washington. He had said perhaps 15 words to her directly. She had said perhaps 15 back. Yes, sir, she said. Not on this line, he said. Do you have access to a Tier 3 secure comm in your facility? I do. 20 minutes, he said, and gave her a code. She hung up and looked at the yellow legal pad on her desk. Then she gathered herself, stood, and walked down the hall to the secure communications room. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. When it was over, Elena Vasquez sat alone in the small, windowless room for a long moment. The hum of the equipment was the only sound. The fluorescent light above her was slightly too bright and slightly too blue. Then she stood, straightened her coat, and walked back to her office. She sat at her desk. She did not pick up the yellow legal pad. She looked at the concrete wall outside her window. Deputy Director Calloway had told her 2 things. The first was that her 12-page supplemental assessment had not, in fact, stayed within the normal internal channels. Someone, she did not know who, and Calloway had not said, had forwarded it up a chain that bypassed Rourke's office entirely. It had reached the DIA's own analytic division 3 days ago. The second thing was a question. Calloway had asked her, Commander, do you know what Titan Eagle is? She had said yes because she did. Titan Eagle was a code name. It was the kind of code name that existed in one specific stratum of the intelligence world, the kind that did not appear in any briefing document at the level of a base staff meeting, the kind that you either knew because you had been read into a specific program, or you didn't know at all. Elena knew it because she had been part of that program, briefly, 2.5 years ago. She had contributed analysis to a 12-month effort aimed at mapping the full command structure of a transnational network. Not the Morales Network specifically, but a parent organization of which the Morales Network was, as it turned out, one working arm. Titan Eagle was not finished, it was ongoing. And the staging point that she had identified in the Eastern Corridor, the one that Rourke had set aside and Thorne had not wanted to hear about in his briefing room, was not merely a logistics node for a regional drug trafficking operation. It was something considerably more important than that. Calloway had not told her everything. He hadn't needed to, she understood enough. She looked at the concrete wall. Then she picked up the yellow legal pad, turned to a fresh page and wrote 2 words at the top. The weekend passed quietly. Elena did not go to Patty's diner. She did not leave base at all on Saturday. She sat in her office for 8 hours on Saturday and 7 hours on Sunday, building something careful and methodical on her yellow legal pads. 4 of them now, filled front and back with diagrams, timelines, notations, and the slow, deliberate architecture of understanding. She was not panicking. She had learned early in her career that panic was the luxury of people who didn't know what they were dealing with. When you understood the shape of a problem, even a serious one, fear became less useful than focus. The shape of this problem was becoming clear. The Morales network, as Admiral Thorne's planning division understood it, was a mid-level narco-trafficking operation. It was a real thing. It was causing real harm. But it was also, in the view of certain people at levels above Coronado and above Thorne, a surface layer, the visible portion of something much larger. The Titan Eagle program had been tracking the deeper structure for 14 months. Elena's supplemental assessment, without her knowing it fully, had touched that deeper structure. The staging point she had identified in the Eastern Corridor was not just a relocated drug depot. It was a communications relay point, one of 5, for a network that extended well beyond narcotics. She did not know all of it. She had not been fully reread into Titan Eagle. But Calloway's call had been specific enough, and she had enough of her own knowledge from her earlier involvement to understand that the operational plan Admiral Thorne was preparing to execute was built on incomplete intelligence, and that executing it on the current timeline, against the original staging location, would not only fail to achieve its objectives, it might compromise something considerably larger. She needed to get that information to the right people. The challenge was that the right people in this situation were not the people directly above her in the chain at Coronado. On Monday morning, she requested a meeting with Admiral Thorne. His aide, a young lieutenant named Chen, who was efficient and pleasant in the way of someone who had decided long ago that his job was to protect the Admiral's time from the world, looked at her request form with the careful expression of someone about to say no without saying no. "The Admiral has a full schedule through the end of the week," Chen said. "I understand," Elena said. "This is a time-sensitive intelligence matter. I'd ask for 15 minutes. "I can pass that along, Commander." "I'd appreciate it." She knew what the answer would be. She had expected it. She had already written the formal request in triplicate, 1 copy to Chen, 1 copy to Rourke's office, 1 copy to the base JAG officer as a matter of record. She had noted the date, time, and nature of the request on each. When you couldn't get through a door, you documented that the door existed and that you had knocked. The response came at 4:30 p.m. The Admiral's schedule did not allow for the meeting this week. Any intelligence matters should be directed through Commander Rourke's office. She filed the response in a folder, labeled simply with Monday's date. The following Tuesday, she ran into Admiral Thorne in the corridor, outside the main conference room. He was coming out of a session with 3 other officers, all of them in mid-conversation, and she was coming in the opposite direction with a folder of documents under her arm. He saw her. There was a fraction of a second in which she could see him register the situation, a choice being made, and then he continued walking without breaking stride. "Admiral," she said, not loudly, not aggressively, just clearly enough that stopping was the reasonable thing to do. He stopped. The 3 officers with him stopped. He turned to look at her with an expression that was perfectly correct in its neutrality. A flag officer who was giving a junior officer the courtesy of his attention, briefly. "Commander." "Sir, I apologize for the informal approach. I've requested a meeting through the proper channels and I understand your schedule is full. I need 60 seconds. He looked at her. Around them, the corridor was not empty. 2 sailors were passing. A woman in civilian clothes was walking toward the exit. None of them were paying close attention, but they were there. "This isn't the time or place, Commander," he said. His voice was even. Patient in the way of a man who had extensive practice being patient with people he found tiresome. "Respectfully, sir, the operational timeline may not give us a better one." Something moved in his expression. Not anger exactly, but something tightened behind his eyes. "Commander Vasquez." He said her name the way he had said it in the briefing room, with the careful, precise articulation of someone reminding themselves of a detail they hadn't considered important enough to memorize. "I'm aware of your supplemental submission. I'm aware of your concerns about the Eastern Corridor. My team has reviewed your analysis, and we are satisfied with the operational intelligence as it stands." "Sir, there are elements of this that go beyond the operational intelligence as it stands." "And what elements would those be?" She looked at him. In her peripheral vision, the 3 officers with him were still. The 2 sailors had passed. The woman in civilian clothes had gone out the exit. She said clearly and quietly, "Titan Eagle." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 2 seconds, but it was not ordinary silence. It was the silence of a room that has changed temperature. Admiral Thorne did not move. His expression did not collapse or crumble. He was 60 years old and had been a SEAL for over 30 years, and men like that did not show shock the way ordinary people did. But something behind his eyes shifted, a rapid internal reorganization of what he was dealing with and who he was dealing with. "That's all," he said quietly to the 3 officers with him. They moved away without a word. He looked at her. When he spoke again, his voice was exactly the same volume, quiet, even, but it had shed the patient with a tiresome subordinate quality entirely. "How do you know that names?" "I was read into the program 2.5 years ago, sir. I contributed analysis to Phase 2. Deputy Director Calloway contacted me last Friday." Another 2 seconds of the rearranging silence. "My office," he said, "now." She sat across from him in a room that was surprisingly undecorated for a man of his rank and legend. A single photo on the wall, she guessed it was his SEAL class. A window that looked out toward the water. A desk that was clear except for a closed laptop, and a mug that said CORNADO in plain black letters. He sat with his hands flat on the desk and looked at her for a moment. "Tell me what Calloway told you," he said. She told him she did not editorialize. She did not use the moment to point out that she had been trying for 3 weeks to get his attention, or that her analysis had been dismissed without credit, and then shelved. She simply laid out the relevant information in the order it was relevant, the way she had been trained to do, the way she had done for 20 years. When she finished, he was quiet. She waited. "The staging point," he said finally. "Yes, sir. If the Eastern Corridor location is what I believe it to be, and the communication intercepts from the last week are consistent with that belief, then the operational plan as currently constructed is going into the wrong location. And beyond the operational failure, there's a secondary risk to the Titan Eagle infrastructure that your planning team may not be aware of." He was quiet again. She had been in enough rooms with enough senior men to know when one of them was doing the difficult private work of adjusting his picture of a situation. It was not always visible, but it had a quality to it, a particular stillness. "You should have been brought in earlier," he said. It was not an apology. It was a statement of fact, offered with the tone of someone who had decided that accurate accounting mattered more than self-protection. "Yes, sir," she said. "That's on me," he said. "I appreciate you saying so, sir." He looked at her. "I don't say things I don't mean, Commander." "I know, sir." He leaned back slightly in his chair and looked at the window. The water was visible in the distance, flat and grey-blue in the October light. "What do you need?" he said. It was the question she had been waiting 3 weeks to be asked. "Access to the full Titan Eagle analytic package, sir. Secure comm with Calloway's team. And a seat at the table when the operational plan gets revised." He looked back at her. "You'll have all 3, he said. What followed was not a movie scene. It was not a dramatic reversal with applause and tearful acknowledgements. It was work, intensive, careful, painstaking work over 6 days that felt more like 6 weeks. Elena sat in the secure analysis room for 10 and 14 hours at a stretch, reviewing the full Titan Eagle package with 2 DIA analysts who had flown in from Washington. She built the revised picture of the Eastern Corridor piece by piece, cross-referencing her own intercept analysis with 14 months of program intelligence that she was only now seeing in its complete form. She was right about the staging point. She had been right from the beginning. She was right about more than that, as it turned out. The communication relay node in the Eastern Corridor was connected to a chain of 4 others, and together those 5 nodes formed the nervous system of a command structure that the Titan Eagle team had been trying to map for over a year. 3 of the other 4 locations were already known. Hers, the one she had flagged in her 12-page assessment that had been shelved by Rourke as overreach, was the 5th, the missing piece. She did not allow herself to feel anything about that while she was working. She locked the feeling in a box labeled later and kept her head down. The operational plan was revised. It took an additional 9 days. The timeline was adjusted. New targeting parameters were established in coordination with the DIA. The Titan Eagle team, operating on the updated intelligence, was able to move on several elements of the larger network before the revised operation was even executed. On a grey Wednesday morning, Admiral Thorne convened a briefing. Elena sat at the table, not at the side, as she had been 7 weeks ago, but near the head, where the primary intelligence advisor sat. Thorne stood at the front of the room and looked around the table at the assembled officers. He was the same man he had always been, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, precise, but something had adjusted in the way he inhabited the room. "Before we review the revised operational plan," he said, "I want to address something. When Commander Vasquez was assigned to this staff 7 weeks ago, her expertise was not integrated into our planning process the way it should have been. That resulted in a significant intelligence gap that could have had serious operational consequences." He looked at Elena directly, not at the group, not at the table, at her. Commander Vasquez identified that gap, submitted her analysis through proper channels, and persisted through multiple obstacles to ensure that critical information reached the people who needed it. The revised plan we're executing is built on her work. I want that clearly on the record. The room was quiet. Derek Howell across the table looked at his folder, then looked up at her, gave a small, genuine nod. Captain Rourke looked at the table. "Commander Vasquez," Thorne said, "anything you want to add before we begin?" She thought about her mother, not making a sound when she cried. She thought about her father's 31 years on the same route in the same truck. She thought about Mr. Browsard, the Marine captain who taught history in Laredo and had told a 17-year-old girl from a house with a leaky roof that she could be something that neither of them had words for yet. "No, sir," she said, "let's just get it right." The operation executed on a cold November morning. Elena was not in the field. That was not her role, and she had never wished it to be. She sat in the operations center and watched the intelligence flow,